To casually say you're going to make a startup to make a completely different internet starting from the ground up, create your own programming language that I've heard also funny stories about, your own operating system. It's like a very tall order.
I was just exposed to like the tyranny of Web 2 platforms from sunup to sundown every day. So I was kind of seduced by this vision of the more beautiful computer that Urbit claimed to be building. Their political program was basically like, instead of democratically elected governments, we should have a patchwork of feudal city states overseen by CEO kings that would solve all the problems of American society and other.
So somehow this like weirdo goofball on the internet writing extremely just kind of rage bait type of stuff and just like edgelordy type of things. We are in the timeline where his work has become important and where we can clearly see the influence in today with like major figures in the Trump presidency.
People were generally really smart and interesting. I met some people through Assembly who I still talk with. We kind of joke that the real Urbit is the friends we made along the way.
This episode is sponsored by NIM, the world's most private VPN that protects your internet traffic and metadata. Unlike traditional VPNs, NIM uses a decentralized mixnet to scramble your internet data, hiding who you're talking to, when, and how often. You can switch between full mixnet mode for maximum anonymity or a faster VPN mode for everyday use. Pay in crypto or fiat, and even your payment stays anonymous thanks to ZK-powered anonymous credentials. Take back control of your online life at nim.com. Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist Podcast, and I have a guest here today. Her name is Adina Glickstein. She's a master's student in media studies under Nathan Schneider at UC Boulder and the editor-at-large at Spike Art Magazine, writing about the intersection of tech and art for quite a few years. And I'm having her on today because she recently wrote a piece titled The Rise and Fall of Urbit in Compact Mag. And I have been wanting to talk about Urbit for such a long time, but haven't been able to yet find someone who would be great to talk about this. So when I found this piece and I found Adina wrote it, I reached out so that she can explain a bit about what Urbit is, why it's so weird, how it connects to all the network state stuff, the weird connection with Curtis Yarvin, all these things. Yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about. So hopefully we can touch all the points during our interview. But maybe just to start off, Adina, if you want to explain a bit what exactly is Urbit, since I think it's a weird one to explain. So I think it's a good one to start.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And thanks for having me. So, as you say, this is a bit of a hard question right from the jump. But in as simple of terms as I can muster, Urbit is a tech startup, and their product is essentially a private personal cloud computer with an ecosystem of applications all kind of linked together across a decentralized network. So one could kind of liken it to the vision of Ethereum as a decentralized, self-owned world computer. I think that they're trying to build something similar, but it's been around for about 20 years. And no one who is currently working on Urbit can quite seem to agree on what it is they're building. So within this already quite ambitious vision, there are a lot of competing ideas and priorities about what it is and what it should be.
Yeah. So like if I can take a stab at what it is, as far as I can understand it, it's like an attempt to make a new internet, just a different internet that doesn't necessarily rely on the specific infrastructure that we normally rely on to use the internet, like HTTP and et cetera, everything that goes underneath that, and instead use almost similar in the idea around blockchains, a distributed or decentralized network of computers to host everything, and then use that as a different internet, more or
Yes,
less.
that's really well put. Yeah. And it has its own operating system and its own
Yeah.
programming language. Like every aspect of the stack has been reinvented from the ground up. But it's an attempt to create a new internet. or as its founder has described it, a new operating system that was designed with the use case of networked computing in mind, which none
Hmm.
of the operating systems like Mac or Windows that we use on the daily day really were. So
Right.
it's a really ambitious reinvention of networked computing.
Yeah. And so it's taking on a really big problem space. It's not
Mm-hmm.
to casually say you're going to make a startup to make a completely different internet starting from the ground up, create your own programming language that I've heard also funny stories about, your own operating system. It's like a very tall order. And it is one that ostensibly, you know, a lot of people are attracted to in some way, including myself when I first heard about it, just because for a lot of people, I mean, the current internet, I think just people are disappointed by what we have right now and are looking for something different. But yeah, I guess I'm curious for you as like choosing Urbit as like the thing you study for your masters. I'm curious what was it that attracted you to it?
Yeah, so I first became interested in Urbit around 2020, in large part because, as you say, the current internet really sucks. There are a lot of problems with it. These problems especially came to the fore in my own life around the first wave of pandemic lockdowns, when a lot of my social life was kettled online and my work was all on the computer, and I was just exposed to like the tyranny of web 2 platforms from sunup to sundown every day, and my
Yeah.
frustration with the state of what's sometimes described now as like techno feudalism really came to a head. So I had a real hunger for alternatives to the internet as it existed, and around then I was starting to become interested in web3, specifically the vision for Ethereum of building like a new user-owned internet that we create together. This idea of new infrastructure that Urbit also proposes. So when around that time, I met some people who worked for Tlon, and they described to me what they were building using the rhetoric that was kind of baked into Tlon's marketing at that time of building a more beautiful computer. I
Hmm.
was really sold on it. It seemed like a very needed and an elegant alternative to the like frustrating stack that I hadn't really known how to extricate myself from up until that point. So it filled a need, and it was a need for privacy, for protection from surveillance and ad tech, potentially a way out of the attention economy. At that time, there was some talk about like users seeing upside for the value they created in networks. And a lot of these really resonated with me as like appealing alternatives to platform capitalism. So I was kind of seduced by this vision of the more beautiful computer that Urbit claimed to be building.
Right. So just to maybe also add that Tlon, like Tlon, is a Tlon Foundation is
Yeah.
the, I mean, I guess the main entity that creates Urbit, if I'm not mistaken, or something like that.
So yeah, kind of. So Tlon Corporation is a private company that was spun off from the Urbit Foundation, I believe 2019, to accelerate Urbit's development. Before that, Urbit was being built by a nonprofit foundation on much the same model as most open source software projects. There are still developers working under the Urbit Foundation to build on Urbit today, as well as other private companies acting in the space. Part of the complication is that Urbit is somehow both like a tech startup and an open source project. And there are
Hmm.
people supported by and housed under a number of different entities contributing to its development. But Tlon Corporation, TLON, which takes its name from Jorge Luis Borges' story, as does Urbit itself, was co-founded by Urbit's creator, Curtis Yarvin, yeah, in
Right.
2019.
So
And
yeah, I think so. The in case people, unsure if they heard that right, like yes, Curtis Yarvin is the founder of Urbit, the original creator. I mean, like you mentioned earlier, started it 20 years ago, but I think it in particular gained a lot of attention at the same time that you were getting into in 2020, which I think of course coincides with the rise of Web3 as well, and the narratives around Web3, around a user-owned internet. So a lot of people that I knew who were involved in the crypto space were also having at least a bit of interest in Urbit and were buying kind of the Ethereum NFTs that were used as like placeholders for having a space within the Urbit uh, internet, if you want to call it that, the Urbit galaxy, I think maybe it's called, or I think there. Anyway, I'll let you explain the hierarchy actually a bit later because I think that's also really fascinating. But yeah, do you want to explain a bit actually for context the relationship to Curtis Yarvin and maybe for really quickly for people who may not know who is Curtis Yarvin?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, really fast, I just got the date wrong. Tlon was founded in
Okay.
2014 to support Urbit's development, so much earlier than I became aware of any of this.
But I think like starting in 2002 or 3, I've read like was when he claims to have started
Yeah,
working
so
on it or
going on
something.
the official timeline on urbit.org, they claim that Urbit started as a quote open ended personal project or an independent study PhD by Curtis Yarvin in 2002.
Independent study PhD
And yeah, so
though.
Tlon was founded in 2014 to better support its development. But up until that point, to the best of
Mhm.
my knowledge, it was mainly being worked on in isolation by this guy, Curtis Yarvin. It is, for all intents and purposes, Yarvin's brainchild. And Yarvin is a Berkeley computer science PhD dropout who has been toying away at this very ambitious project for something on the order of 20 years with the idea to design a new operating system that's better suited to the world of networked computing. And Yarvin, is maybe better known in some circles for his pseudonym Mencius Moldbug. He wrote a blog under that name in the late 2000s, early 2010s called Unqualified Reservations, which was a thought leader in the neo-reactionary online space. He was involved with what's sometimes called the Dark Enlightenment, alongside thinkers like Nick Land, espousing this kind of bonkers fusion of like monarchism and libertarianism, sometimes called neo-cameralism. That was
Mhm.
Yarvin's term for it. Their political program was basically like, instead of democratically elected governments, we should have a patchwork of feudal city states overseen by CEO kings that would solve all the problems of American society and other society today. And this like neo-reactionary vision gained a lot of traction in certain online circles around that time, but also got a lot of blowback. Rightly so.
Mhm.
And in part because Moldbug is notoriously really anti-democratic. He's famous for introducing phrases like rage, retire all government employees, and was influential on people like Peter Thiel, who sort of notoriously claimed that he views democracy and freedom as incompatible, or on people like Steve Bannon. So Moldbug's influence has like seeped into the
Yeah.
mainstream of the American alt-right over that time. And the identities of like Curtis Yarvin and Mencius Moldbug are in some ways distinct, but in other ways kind of inextricable. So that's the mind that Urbit is springing forth from.
Right, right. So the one, kind of point I would love to, or connection I'd love to make, of course, is when this term neo-cameralism, for people who have listened to all the episodes around the network states and our critiques of it, it sounds a lot like network
Mhm.
states, question mark. This was a, a, a connection that I had made back in, I can't remember if it was 2022 or 2023 at Zuzalu when I was there. You can find there's the presentation that I gave at Suzalu from that time where I explicitly made the connection between network states and patchwork by Curtis Yarvin and this neo-cameralism term. So somehow this like weirdo goofball on the internet writing extremely just kind of rage bait type of stuff and just like edgelordy type of things has somehow we are in the timeline where his work has become important and where we can clearly see the influence in now today with like major figures in the Trump presidency. He's getting interviewed by the New York Times and whoever else, whereas before he had been kind of ignored. Yeah, he's also and he's also the founder of Urbit.
Yeah, no, exactly. And just to tease out that connection, I think, between Urbit and network states a little bit more, and we can get into it more later if you want, but just
Mhm.
to make this point really explicit, I think both adopt this vision of exit as like the mode of politics, which I know you've talked about a lot in your critiques of the
Mhm.
network state, but like as you and Primavera spoke about, like there is no internal politics within the network state. There's only geopolitics. There's only conflict between two opposing network states, because I think the ideal form of governance in a network state, as in Urbit and as in Yarvin's writings as Moldbug, is just that if you don't like how things are going, you can fork, you can hit the road, you can vote with your feet and exit. He's not a big fan of democratically accountable governance or, voice. He sees that as politics, derogatory, and that instead of like internal discourse and consensus building, the way to make change in one's community is to leave that community and start a new one if you don't like, what's happening.
Right.
And that comes directly from a lot of his blogging on unqualified reservations in like the late aughts.
Right. So let's, move. So we've talked about, like abstractly kind of these large, high level critiques about things, but like, what was it actually like being on the inside a bit, I guess? I never went to an Urbit event before. So you wrote in your piece, the process of falling in and out of love with Urbit and being like an active participant in the Urbit community. So I'm curious if you can kind of give us the TLDR of that whole experience.
Yeah, no, totally. So I started going to Urbit meetups. I went to a couple in person when I was living in Berlin and met really like kind, cool, interesting people. I was active on the network and had some nice chats. There's a great, super vibrant experimental music community on Urbit. A lot of people making really good DJ mixes, great like ambient music scene, which is one of my side interests.
Sounds like
so I connected
reminiscent
with
of
some
like
people through that.
CCRU. Like
Yeah, very much so. And I think that connection is in people's minds.
Yeah.
People see themselves in that lineage for sure.
Yeah, I respect. I've heard like I don't know if you've seen. I can't remember who said it, but like they claim that Nick Land didn't do that much for philosophy, but he did make some good music, or something like that in the '90s.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And my own interest in the CCRU, and admittedly, I fell a little more on the Mark Fisher side than the Nick Land side, but I studied abroad in London and university and became really enamored with the CCRU and a lot of these kind of 90s ideas about philosophy and cybernetics and jungle music. So that probably conditioned my interest in Urbit. And I connected with other people who shared that profile through the Urbit community. So in 2022, after I had been active on the network for a couple of years, I attended Urbit Assembly with the intention of covering it for Spike, the art magazine that I was working for full time at that point. And my experience in the community and at Assembly was by and large really positive. Like Urbit definitely feels like, at least at that point in time, it was a Schelling point for really like smart, interesting, thoughtful people, many of whom had political leanings that were very different from my own. But I think like the tenor of discourse was really respectful. People were generally really smart and interesting. I met some people through Assembly who I still talk with. We kind of joke that the real Urbit is the friends we made along the way. But also, I think at Assembly in 2022, I started to realize that the broader vision for the project, or the direction that it was heading, raised some ideological quibbles for me, in that a lot of the work being done at that point was trying to align Urbit explicitly with the network state. Like Balaji was the keynote speaker that year, and there were some other panels, including like people who had architected the DAO laws in Wyoming, or who had worked on the legal team involved in establishing Prospera, the special economic zone in Honduras. And yeah, a lot of these movements that really sought to advance like exit as a mode of politics. And I have some issues.
And did you know about a lot of these things beforehand, or was it there listening to them, then you were like, oh, I don't know if I agree with this?
I had a vague awareness of some of this stuff beforehand. Like I knew about like seasteading and some of Peter Thiel's like failed exit movements in the past, but I wasn't that intimately familiar with it. And I remember a moment when I was sitting at a panel at Assembly, at a panel called Forking the American Code Base.
Was
And
Balaji
the sales pitch of this panel, no, Balaji was not on this one. But it was like the warm up to the network state keynote.
Yeah.
And Justin Murphy was on this one.
Ah, okay.
And like, I just remember sitting there thinking, like, they're just advocating neo-colonialism. They're literally just saying, like, go take your Bitcoin bucks to Latin America and build what you will with no concern for like the ways of life already being lived there. And it felt really like, I don't know, I had a good like lefty liberal arts education, and I was like indoctrinated in the post-colonial critical thought cabal. So there was just a lot of stuff that I was like shocked by how on the face, how overt it was
Right.
that they were calling for this kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, that is another thing, like, especially somehow, I mean, I don't know, I guess, like, one of the big things that I try to bring when I talk to network state people is just the critique that it is neo-colonial, but I also find that a lot of people don't even know what that means, or if I mean, they just kind of like justify it as like, it's like so ridiculous. Like it is so on the nose. Like they may not know about it, and then they like say the exact things to look out for when you're trying to like assess if something is neo-colonial. We're bringing them jobs, we're bringing money into their country. Like we're really helping them out. Like it's yeah, I've had very frustrating conversations with people about this. I just say to keep it short. And did you find that like was any of this kind of developed in like Trumpism as well, or with like it feels like almost like this, and I feel like it probably has like some relation to do with Urbit and some relation to do with Milady's NFTs and stuff, of like this kind of undercurrent of like intellectual quote unquote right wing people that I find just like
Yeah.
so strange. But anyways.
No, there was totally that contingent at Assembly that was present. I didn't touch it that much, but I was peripherally
Yeah.
aware that some of those people were in the room.
Fair. And so I would love to talk about how exactly Urbit works a bit, at least. We don't have to go into like that deep of technical detail, of course, but maybe to like preface this, what I think is really funny that I read in, I believe in your article, that Mars Review, if I understand correctly, was a publication that was meant to cover Urbit and like the Urbit ecosystem. They were hosted on Urbit at first, but then they had so many technical difficulties, it sounds like, that they just switched to Substack eventually. Now they have a Substack. And I don't know if they're on Urbit anymore.
So no, I believe they are still
Okay.
somewhat active as an Urbit group. And the initial conceit was for it to be a literary magazine, on the model of like the New
Okay,
York Review
I
of
see.
Books. And they were publishing content that was sometimes about Urbit, sometimes more just general, like alt-lit, especially because that demographic was interacting with Urbit a fair amount around the time that I got interested in it. So they were publishing, book reviews and like literary essays in addition to kind of tech criticism that spoke to the need for platforms like Urbit. The editor of the Mars Review published a book about the history of Urbit on Urbit. But then as their readership grew, and I think as they especially kind of gained cultural purchase with like quote unquote non-technical users, it just became prohibitively challenging or limiting to publish exclusively on Urbit. So they launched a Substack, which is now I think where most of their engagement probably comes from. And yeah, it's kind of a funny irony that speaks to the problem that I think a lot of creators who were drawn to Urbit really quickly faced, which is that it was being marketed as this platform for artists and writers who could like monetize their creative work through these new pathways. I think much like the sales pitch of Web3. But then in reality, like the infrastructure was really buggy, it was frustrating, and the audience just wasn't there. So they reverted to where the audience was. And it's like, a microcosm of, I think, what's happened with Urbit at scale.
Yeah. So maybe we can, could you explain a bit about how it works? Because Urbit, I think, when I kind of like started learning about how it worked, I was kind of like, it was very strange. I mean, it was like it's a different economic model compared to how the internet exists today. but I don't know if I would necessarily call it a better model, or not like a particularly one that I find that exciting. And I say this as someone also who was very close to buying a planet, I think they're called, but yeah, I'll let you explain it.
Yeah. So like at the interface level, it's basically an app that you can run on your computer that has its own UX, that has like a forum group chat kind of thing, which is what most people talk about when they talk about Urbit. In addition to some other apps like a radio station, like an anonymous gossip platform, a Bible verse a day app, and it's running on its own operating system and keyed into its own decentralized network. And address space on this network is apportioned as Ethereum NFTs.
Mhm.
So there are three tiers of address space in Urbit's identity system called planets, stars, and galaxies. And planets are the smallest and cheapest form of permanent address space. Each planet has a host star, and then each star in turn is housed under a galaxy. And galaxy owners have governance power over Urbit as a tech project, basically through what's called the Galactic Senate, which is something like a corporate board of directors to the Urbit Foundation, which is one of these many entities that's overseeing the project. Although I believe the Galactic Senate is a distinct entity from the actual board of directors of the Urbit
Mm.
Foundation, which is a Cayman foundation. And the
Right.
disconnect between those
Classic.
two will become important. So, yeah, tracing the project's governance structure is like really a challenge. But basically, it is a peer to peer network with a federated hierarchy of different types of address space where your power over the way that the network is run and the way that the project continues to be developed is directly proportional to the amount of digital real estate that you
Hmm.
own.
Almost sounds a lot like neo-cameralism, if I'm not mistaken.
Uh-huh. In fact, I think Yarvin has like gleefully referred to it as techno feudalism. This is his
Right.
desire for the way that
So
things
like
are
if you
shaped.
have a planet, then you have to like you're ruled by your star who is ruled by their galaxy. And a galaxy has several stars and a star has several planets.
Yeah, and the way that I've heard people describe it in the past is that as a planet, your relationship to your star is basically like a user of the normal internet's relationship to their internet
Hmm.
service provider. So it's unclear to me how much, project level governance power stars are really meant to have. But as far as deciding what is Urbit, which aspects of this extremely ambitious vision are going to get realized and in what way, that decision making power comes from
Hmm.
galaxy owners. And then, of course, each of these like parcels of digital real estate has speculative financial value as
Right.
an Ethereum NFT, which has been hugely important in
Right.
capitalizing the project.
And so with the planet as well, so like if I'm thinking as if I'm a individual user, do I need to own a planet or something like that in order to use Urbit?
I think there are temporary forms of address space that you can launch to like access the network. Yeah, temporarily called
Mm,
comets. I don't know if those are still around or how they work, but I remember at one point there was a way of getting on the network without owning
right.
permanent address space. But yes, basically, to participate in Urbit, one should
Right.
own a planet.
And do you remember how many planets there were? 'Cause I can't, I think there was like, it was less than the amount of people in the world or something like that. Like it wasn't, it was like maybe a couple billion, I want to say. Maybe you'll find it
Yeah, it's
billion.
about 4 billion. So address space is in theory limited, which is
Right.
right related to its value. It's a 128-bit identity space. So
Right.
256 galaxies, about 65,000 stars, and then about 4 billion planets
Right.
and comets under the planets. But no one knows how comets work. No one talks
You
about
don't matter if
comets.
you don't own a planet. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, but it's true. It's like throw
And
away.
then each of these things, if I understand correctly, have like they have like code names as well, which are like you may have seen them if you traveled in the internet, like, and been around Urbit circles. There's like, it has the tilde on either side of them or something like that, and they're kind of like, you can pronounce them in English, but they don't mean anything type of words.
Yeah, it's called a PATP, and it's derived from the bit identifier for your planet. So my old one, my planet that I lost access to a couple years ago, very sadly, but that I was the most emotionally attached to, was called. And at assemblies and meetups, you hear people calling each other by their apps instead of their government names sometimes, and it has a
Right.
real sci-fi cast to it, or like fantasy in
Yeah.
a way.
I think it is interesting how they use these little tricks to kind of make it cute and to kind of create some amount of culture within, the cohort of people who are using Urbit. There's maybe something to learn from that.
Mhm.
Everyone needs a cute little name
Yeah.
that they can call their friends.
Yeah.
That's not their real name.
Yes.
Everyone needs a little nickname.
Yes.
But so yeah, like, clearly, like, Urbit is a technical instantiation of what we can probably say is like dark enlightenment politics, political theory, what they believe ideally how the world ought to be run. They're doing it in this almost like uh, what's it, like, playground type of setting, or using the digital space to kind of play around with it, so we don't have to deal with, perhaps some neo-colonial aspects to it, because nobody actually lives on the internet. There's no one living on your planet. You can simply just buy it. And so it mimics this kind of like digital terra nullius, but also provides this uh, limited supply to where there's ostensibly, some upside to be gained from it. But yeah, why do you think, what kind of like something I've been wrestling with for a while is that, like, the right has been generally a lot more proactive with building its own technical infrastructure. I don't know if it's so simple as simply like there are more tech guys on the right and they're more willing to take on insane projects. But yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are, since you were, being there in person. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of possible reasons for that. The most obvious one being because they have money for it, and that people like Peter Thiel are really willing to invest in projects that advance their own anti democratic views. There are a lot of really worthy and important DIY tech infrastructure projects that don't have that right wing valence.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like the permacomputing movement,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there's no money in that.
Right.
So it's not as high profile, or it's not as sustainable. But I also think beyond just following the money, there's maybe a more emergent way in which anti democratic power creeps into tech projects. And it has to do with this whole like voice and exit distinction. Like, if people can't just speak up and weigh in on the things that they want to change in their community, or, in a peer production setting in a software project they're building, is their only way of registering their difference of opinion to vote with their feet or fork it or start something else. If that's the case, then like, just numerically, you end up having more tech projects led by people who believe in a politics of exit, because they have to keep leaving existing things and building new ones because there's like no conflict resolution internally. I don't know if that is like provably true in practice, but this is kind of one of my hypotheses is like, you just get more new things starting because people don't believe in working shit out.
Right. Interesting.
And yeah, I think there's also something there that like speaks to a broader problem within dev culture, where people who might not like self-identify as political in any particular way, or set out to make something political, end up taking up like a right-leaning or at least highly individualist position, which you see some of when you hear Yarvin talk about his own childhood. It's like, he didn't want to work together with other people. He didn't want to play outside with his friends. He wanted to be unbothered, like being a precocious math genius in peace. And there's this belief in like meritocracy that goes so far as to treat social relationships as like an impediment
Right.
to the like individual genius. And this like founder mythology
Yeah.
can be really toxic and can, I think, lead people to over-index on an idea of individualism that leads them into like right libertarianism. Or Coraline Ada Amke, who's responsible for creating a code of conduct for open source contributors, has written really beautifully about what she calls the dehumanizing myth of the meritocracy in software development, which is this idea that like achievement and bootstrapping should be respected above everything, including like the delicate work of building relationships with the other people who we're making things with. And I think all of these kind of perspectives that fetishize like being the best all by yourself, like naturally lead one to take up a more right-leaning or individualist libertarian position, when in reality, like intellect doesn't exist in a vacuum. But if you have to fight to believe that it does, then you kind of back yourself into that corner. So there's this like marriage of convenience between the situated norms of software production and certain right-leaning ideas. And then, of course, this all ties back into the history of cyber libertarianism, with people like John Perry Barlow being really influential in the early days of the World Wide Web. Mm-hmm. The idea that cyberspace is this new frontier to be conquered. I think all those ideas will resonate with someone who has a certain perspective about, social relationships that has a little more of a right-wing cast to it.
Yeah. Definitely there is something to say for just the norms of software development and how that just lends itself well to a lot of right-wing politics, unfortunately. And just like the way that software development is taught and just the way that the culture has been produced within that type of work. For one reason or another, it really like focuses on the individual like hacker coder who can like build entire applications all by himself if he was just to like be given all the tools that he could possibly need. And so I think I think it's interesting to say with like this exit idea, this obsession with exit maybe is that because even if they're not political, if they want to prove themselves as someone who can make cool things, then they would go and get venture capital. Like they explicitly keep making things that are investable, perhaps. And so there is always like money flowing in that way, because it also, they don't care necessarily to reject investor logic, as much as Vin is wanting to be alternative and like create this new alternative internet through Urbit. Like it seems to be having the same kind of process that all these VC invested tech companies have had, but maybe at like an accelerated rate because of its particularness. Or I mean, it has certain things that are very alternative to it, but they're specific to it. So yeah, like I think just the plethora of things that A16Z can invest in, and Mark Andreessen being so overtly right wing that maybe that's why they keep getting to go again.
Yeah, no, exactly. Exactly.
So before the interview, you also shared with me some news from Urbit. There's a little bit of a drama that is ongoing at this moment that I would love for you to spill the tea for us. What exactly is going on in the Urbit world? Are people happy with it? Do they like the direction? Is it working?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe a bit of backstory to the tea is that for many years, Curtis Yarvin was pretty distant from Urbit. He was not officially working on the project. And this was the case when I became interested in it. Like the year that I went to assembly, he wasn't there. He wasn't officially named on any of the project documentation. Some people speculate that he was like forcibly distanced from it as it approached market readiness, because people were afraid that his association would be kind of toxic. But then in August of 2024, as the Urbit Foundation was rapidly running out of money, Yarvin kind of unceremoniously walked back onto the project in some like unnamed leadership capacity. And he notionally named someone else as the director of the Urbit Foundation. But basically, Yarvin was pulling the strings. He returned as the public face of the project. He gave a number of talks about the future of Urbit, and he was really like, he styled it as like a founder's triumphant return to rescue his company from being run into the ground by the people who were leading in the interim. And in the maybe last 4 or 5 months, he's been a little quieter. He stopped giving his wartime addresses and fireside chats. And a new acting executive director of the Urbit Foundation, a guy named Ryan Neer, has been leading things quite, competently and quietly. But as of a couple of weeks ago, there was something of a coup, as several members of the community have described it, when Neer attempted to fire Curtis, and the board immediately retaliated. So on June 25th, the board of directors of the Urbit Foundation, which, remember, is not the same thing as the Galactic Senate, voted to remove Neer as the executive director and to install Curtis officially in his place. So to officially grant Curtis the title of executive director of the Urbit Foundation. And in response to that, Neer has launched a proposal to maintain control, which is currently up for a vote in the Galactic Senate. And as of this recording, as of this morning, is tied 19-19, with about half of Galaxy owners still yet to vote and voting open for like 2 more weeks. So the Urbit community is deeply divided about whether, this prior director, who was a longtime contributor to Urbit and is really aligned with a lot of the devs who have been extremely loyal to the project, or, the other side of the split is people who are loyal to Curtis, maybe people who really believe in his founder mythology more than in what Urbit is right now, or to the VCs who have recently invested in Urbit and who want to push it in a more financially expedient direction that really hinges on Yarvin's persona as its leader. And the longtime devs see this as a betrayal. They see this as promoting Curtis as a figure over Urbit as a project, which may once have been his brainchild, but is now the result of a lot of different people's work and could be something different or something more ambitious than this kind of compromised vision of what they see Curtis to be pushing today. So they're essentially like organizing against Yarvin. And I don't think many people involved in the project would cast it in those terms of like labor organizing against capital.
Right.
But the split between the developers and then like the founder and his venture backers, that's basically what's going on.
Right.
And there's now a petition where any users, not just Galaxy owners, but like planets or anyone with any amount of address space, can sign in support of the potentially ousted director's proposal. So it can sign in support of like the dev side, the labor side, which is interesting because basically this drama has created like an emerging mechanism for voice-based governance in Urbit, like contravening the project's entire history and all of Yarvin's design intentions, where the only way to make your voice heard is to fork and do something else.
Like, no voice,
which there have been efforts to do in the past.
He was like, no, you guys
and now they're suddenly like, wait, right? Suddenly, everyone's like, wait, we want voice.
Yeah, that's, I mean, to me, incredible. It's kind of like a unsurprising, of course. Like these things like always happen. It's just kind of like, I think it's a clear, it's like a clear situation of when just the contradictions manifest themselves with dark enlightenment thinking and like trying to do things in groups and how those just like don't really align super well. But I read like they made a website, I guess it was the director and like I guess supported by a bunch of the devs. And he says, quote, well, I was wrong to think working with Curtis was viable. That was really funny. I mean, it doesn't really go into like too much detail as to why it's not working, if I'm not mistaken. But like interesting to see that. But I guess so there is also, I think you were mentioning to me before, like a part of it has to do with like the direction of the project that he wants to take it versus the developers. I don't think would you mind explaining a bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that in the last few months, some people have come to believe that Yarvin is compromising on his initially very ambitious vision for Urbit, and that because of the need to raise money to continue developing the project, he's like narrowed or specified his idea of what it should be. This could go along a couple different lines. I've seen him talking about trying to make Urbit like the main digital identity standard to compete with things like WorldCoin. So, understandably, a lot of the devs think that's a really bad direction for it to take. One of the other fault lines right now is actually that a lot of people who have been working on Urbit are much more explicitly aligned with crypto than Yarvin is, and they take issue with his unwillingness to brand Urbit as a crypto project, despite the fact that it uses blockchain infrastructure. So part of the rift is that the developers want Urbit to be explicitly a crypto project. Yarvin is trying to trot out new ways of positioning it as like an investable, venture-backed, like Silicon Valley startup that needs to become a profitable app. Whereas the community and the developers see it as like along the lines of many other blockchain projects with high, ambitious aims, perhaps like I think what Ryan Neer, the outgoing, or hopefully not outgoing, but the contested director has said is as a revolutionary infrastructure for user ownership and coordination. So that's the split.
Which is quite different than all exit and no voice. User owned internet.
Yeah.
But it's super funny. I mean, in this case, if we continue with your framing, labor has chosen crypto. But in part, I mean, actually, when you explain it that way, it starts to make more sense to me. I think, like by the creation of the token, it's like a desire for exposure to upside, right? Like to give you the ones who are building it more exposure to upside, and not just the I mean, I don't know what their equity, if they're sharing equity or have an equity split or something like that does expose developers to upside or not, but yeah.
No, as far as I know, the financial model right now is just cut along the like planet star galaxy hierarchy, where your exposure to upside is just tied to the value of the overall network and then the proportion of that address space that you own on the network.
Right.
So I think in some ways, a token would be more equitable.
So with 4 billion planets, a person really only needs one, I guess, in order to use it. There's not that much incentive to buy. Like a lot of buying has to happen before I would think upside happens within that the digital real estate model, versus a token is like, boom, if you have liquidity, I mean, you have upside, especially as someone who would be given tokens at the launch, I guess.
Right. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Yarvin has been really adamantly opposed to the whole token idea, and has even said that that's why he fired the old executive director of the Urbit Foundation last summer, is because the idea of a token was coming up. Yeah, right. I think he just thinks that it's a bad look. He thinks it would be like trashy.
Which is interesting, because he has a lot of fans in the crypto space, I think.
Yeah.
So it is funny. It's like almost like he dislikes the people who are his fans, or at least one segment of them being crypto people.
Yeah. And like, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the takeaways of this whole debacle is that it's becoming, again, abundantly clear that he's deeply individual, deeply idiosyncratic, and extremely hard to work with.
Right.
And it's funny because it's like, to your point earlier, who could have possibly guessed that someone who holds beliefs like his is like at heart a deeply antisocial person who's kind of uncompromising and you wouldn't want as your boss.
Right.
Like, who would have guessed?
Right. It feels also like a manifestation of kind of like EAC type of thinking, like effective accelerationist type of thinking, who are also very inspired by Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin. These people, I mean, I can't, what the guy's name, like Beth Jesus.
Beth Jesus.
Yeah, like I remember he said something that actually was interesting. I mean, it was horrible, but it was interesting, of like kind of describing the corporation as the extension of the founder, like as a technology of extending the founder, and like getting employees to do your will is like the extension of yourself as a founder. It's like, it's kind of another type of extreme version of the founder myth, that is just like taking the logic of software development and the soft crypto technology world and just taking it to another extreme. But I mean, it was interesting for me, because in a sense, it's kind of like he's kind of right, in a way, he's right. Like, you can reframe a corporation as a technology that extends oneself, as you can think of, like, a baseball bat extending oneself in some way. But, like, you know, it's also bad. Like, it also like is a manifestation of, like, in this case specifically, like, market-based authoritarianism, I guess, is kind of how I think about it.
Right. Or at the most literal level, what is a corporation? It is an organization of people who are like coordinating to achieve a goal. And if you tend to see groups or organizations as an extension of your personal will or like malleable according to your own desires and beliefs, like that's a particular view of social life.
Yeah.
And it's not the view that I hold, but people in this space, some of them very well might. I don't know. I haven't read the Beth Jesus tweet that you're
Yeah,
referring
it
to,
was a
but
while ago. I mean, I don't like to look at his posts, but sometimes they
yeah,
pop up, and that one in particular struck me. But has any of this, like, tied into, like, anything around Trump? And, like, because Curtis Yarvin, there are constant reports out there of, like, Curtis Yarvin being being in someone's ear, that he has some connection with Steve Bannon, but unclear whether they like each other. He's connected with Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is connected to JD Vance. Has any of this kind of come up? Like, I can see in part investors being like, no, Urbit, we got to invest in this guy because this guy has, like, the ear of someone in the presidency. And, like, that's a good investment, something to invest in. So it's almost like
yeah,
overt corruption, but other people can also see it as problematic, of course.
yeah. I mean, I don't know because in some ways his influence over a lot of the people who now hold power in the U.S. government has been like so overt that it doesn't even really need to be justified. Like it doesn't matter whether he's friends with these people. They've clearly read his blog or his ideas have filtered down
Mm-hmm.
in such a way as to have influence, kind of irrespective of his own persona or behavior at this point.
Mm-hmm.
There is some like disagreement about how close exactly Curtis is to anyone in the current administration. Like some people describe him as a guru to JD Vance, but then, in his New York Times profile, Yarvin himself says like, we've met once or twice. He kind of disavows that connection.
Yeah.
And I think he's like played it up at certain times and then played it down at others. So there's a lot of hedging around how close they actually are. But the ideological connection is pretty clear. And I think a lot of like alt-right, dark enlightenment intellectual ideas that are manifesting more in the mainstream today are in some way downstream of Curtis Yarvin, more or less explicitly. And that people who weren't familiar with him by name before are now like looking back at what he's done
Mm-hmm.
and tracing that intellectual lineage.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been really weird to
So
have, like,
yeah,
kind of more mainstream liberals also know about Curtis Yarvin. It's like, or like dark enlightenment, like Nick Land type of, like, all these things that have just been like a weird thing that I've obsessed over the years that now all of a sudden are like mainstream by like random
yeah,
liberals I just like never expected to ever care about this. Now suddenly they have to.
no, no, exactly. It's quite wild. I mean, there was a morning where I was at my dad's house and he was reading the New York Times in the other room, and he's like, "Oh my God, Curtis Yarvin, is that the guy that you've been yapping about all this time?" Like, yeah, that's the one.
That's great.
But I mean, I think, yeah, like correctly, even people on the left who weren't familiar with Curtis Yarvin before are now looking at what's happening in the US and
Well,
trying to make sense of a lot of the insanity and are terrified and also probably kind of like titillated or satisfied in a perverse way to see that stuff like Doge is like being ripped from this like internet philosopher's playbook. That there's some history there
yeah.
is is interesting and maybe gives people some like context to grab onto.
I gave a couple of talks to some Tesla takedown protesters, trying to explain to them the origins of Doge, or like the kind of political roots of it, and just having to explain Curtis Yarvin to like, people who are just, I mean, they're just, I mean, good for them, are not as chronically online as I am and have not read all of these things that I don't wish upon most people. Having to explain that just feels so strange. It's just like, if it sounds really dumb and weird, it's because it is. And for some, now we have to take it seriously.
Yeah.
But so, I guess with this coup, any thoughts on any predictions on what you think will happen?
It's so neck and neck right now. I mean, it's tied. So I have no idea what the outcome of the vote will be. But I do think that whatever happens, the odds that Yarvin loses power in any meaningful or permanent way are pretty low, as we've seen throughout the history of Urbit.
Mm-hmm.
There are moments when he steps back, there are moments when he takes the reins. But I think in the long arc of Urbit, Yarvin will probably always be the benevolent dictator for life.
Right, right. Even if he gets kicked out, I think I've heard that he owns a very significant portion of the planets or stars or galaxies or whatever. So
I don't know if that's true. And again, this is like he's played it up at some points and played it down at others. I know that when he left Tlon initially, he still privately held some amount of address space, but like gave back also a meaningful amount of decision-making power that was like vested in his Urbit address ownership. So I think it's unclear. And that's part of the issue, is like no one actually really knows how much of it Curtis holds at a given time. It's impossible to trace.
Right, right. So after all of this that we've talked about, I'm curious if you have any thoughts, because in your writing in the article, which I highly recommend people to check out again, the kind of framing that generally Urbit and like also common in crypto has a libertarian root to it. The framing of like building technical infrastructure is through the frame of sovereignty, or declaring or just expressing sovereignty over one's, well, self-sovereignty is usually the word that's used. Is there anything there to salvage from Urbit for a kind of like more solidaristic movement, tech movement? I think you mentioned in the article that you were looking for solidarity actually instead of sovereignty. But yeah, if is there anything to salvage, and maybe if you could rebuild Urbit's governance, how would you change it?
Yeah. So I think Urbit's point of departure, which is that we all need more sovereignty than we have under the current Web 2 paradigm, remains totally correct. And it's just a question of how do you actualize it? And the conclusion that I've come to is that using Urbit as it presently exists does not grant me the kind of sovereignty that I am the most interested in, which is not necessarily like individual liberty, which I'm not even sure if it grants that to any meaningful measure. But like I'm given to see sovereignty as a matter of like strength and interdependence. And that's still something that I want from my experience of networked computing. And maybe there are like little tendrils of projects that have started in the Urbit community that could lead towards that. One area where I see that being possible is some of the work being done around privacy. There's a lot of really interesting privacy related stuff coming out of the Urbit space, including a zero knowledge layer 1 blockchain called Knockchain, which recently launched and I find really interesting. And I think that there's a lot of important application for privacy tech on the left and in building solidarity movements. Of course, it all comes down to how it's deployed and the manner in which people use it and educate others about it and work together to steward it. But I think that there's a lot of potential there. Anne Brody is doing some really interesting work right now, both around like the rise of zero knowledge and also around alternatives to like the sovereign individual, or the idea of like kind of libertarian anarchist sovereignty as it's been privileged in tech circles. And the answer that she offers instead is like relational autonomy, which is this kind of strength and interdependence instead of the fantasy of like the total independent self-sovereign So I hope that those ideas could find more realization
Mm-hmm.
through some of the privacy tech coming out of the ecosystem. Then to answer, I think, your second question, if I could rebuild Urbit's governance, how would I change it? I would structure in more pathways for voice from the outset, like more fora for the kind of collective decision making and transparency and discourse about how the project is being steered that we're seeing now with stuff like the petition. And there have been attempts to do this over the years. Like there's a GitHub page for Urbit improvement proposals, kind of in step with the governance model that a lot of open source projects use for making more transparent decisions about development priorities. But it's like barely utilized. And I think that's probably because this wasn't structured into Urbit's governance from the outset. So I think like if I were to design it right now, I would bake in more accountability mechanisms like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the petition supporting Nir's proposal right now is a very cool thing. And, you know, who knows how different of a position Urbit would be in today if there had been more opportunities for the people who are closest to the metal across all tiers of ownership to exercise more voice and weigh in like that around other like pivotal development moments earlier on. Because I think a lot of those decisions have been made fairly unilaterally, whether by Tlon leadership or by Yarvin.
Mm.
Yeah, so just more pathways for democratic accountability, which Yarvin would dismiss as politics. But I think to anyone who's ever contributed to like a successful software project, this is just the kind of like frustrating but necessary work of consensus building that needs to be done.
I mean, you know, the way that he has it now is clearly not preventing politics. So, I mean, it's like that. I think this is what's like, because this is something I've like repeated so many times with the network state stuff. Is just like, as much as you don't want there to be politics, like it's always there. You like, it's all political. It's not that people are politicizing things. It's that like it's just in the air. It exists, you know, and you got to engage with it somehow.
And it just ratchets everything up
Yeah.
instead of having like a nice civil
Yeah.
discussion about where things should go. You have to have a coup. Like it's
But in many
so
ways that
maybe people
also
thrive on the
fits that
drama.
fit his, you know, politics in many ways. Like in the feudal times, like there would be just continuous coups of, you know, assassinating a king or whatever to put in a new one, or, you know, like they're doing the thing that actually Curtis Yarvin has, I think, pretty explicitly has said like is the way things should go anyways. So it is kind of funny when it's happening against him. He's all of a sudden like, "Whoa, guys, pump the brakes."
Right. Yeah, kind of got to hand it to them.
Yeah, you would one would think that networked networked computing would lend itself well to a form of collectivity that that does not that does not fit like a libertarian politics, or you would think would fit more a politics of solidarity. So that's definitely something that uh, I'm also interested in, and I think a lot of people who are listening into are listening in, and we're hoping what crypto would become. But I think it's still taking some time
Mhm.
for us to get there.
I'm still waiting. But in the meantime, I'm still, listening to your podcast and scheming about how that still may yet come into being.
One day, comrade, we'll make it. Well, thanks so much for coming on and for sharing about Urbit. It was a weird one. It's a weird project to talk about. I appreciate that you are doing your thesis on it and sharing the type of ideas that are that were going on in that space and criticizing it appropriately. Where can people maybe read more about your work if you like to point them anywhere?
Well, thank you, Josh, for having me and for bearing with me through a lot of the weirdness that I think inevitably arises in conversations about Urbit. Where can people read more of my work? Well, I write a monthly tech column for Spike Art magazine, which is called User Error. And I think that might be of interest to some listeners here. I recently revived it after taking a little bit of a hiatus. So that'll be publishing monthly in the future. And I also occasionally write for some other places, mostly about art. And regrettably, the best way to keep track of what I'm publishing is Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, user error is, I think, the plug that I would throw the most weight behind right now. It might be of most interest to folks around here.
Yeah, sure. I'll have those plugs in the show notes. But yeah, thanks again, Adina. And yeah, I'll catch you later. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you so much.
Bye.